it looks like Wladamir Klitschko's April voluntary defence will be against Bryant Jennings. I had previously speculated that I thought this fight was unlikely, because I thought Jennings was in line for a potentially easier fight against the winner of Stavern versus Deontay Wilder. He had to face the winner of that fight for the WBC belt. Clearly, he's been made an offer he can't refuse, and I don't think it's been officially announced, but it's now being reported on very, very numerous sources all over the internet that this fight is set to be made. It's going to be a defence on New York. It's going to be on HBO. And it makes sense, because I think Bryant Jennings has fought on HBO quite a few times. Obviously, Klitschko wants to build interest in America. I think the other factor that makes sense is there's some argument on boxing forums that if Klitschko was to beat Jennings, not only would he retain all his titles, but he would also take Jennings' spot as the WBC mandatory #1 spot. In essence, Klitschko would win the right to fight Bryant Stavern versus Deontay Wilder for the WBC belt, thus meaning he could unify the titles. If that is the case, it makes sense. I've also read other articles suggesting Alexander Povetkin, who I believe was just behind Bryant Jennings in the rankings. He recently won an eliminator against Carlos Takam in the WBC, and that report suggested that Povetkin may get the chance to fight the Stavern Wilder winner, which again is a fascinating fight. Either way, it appears that there'll be some good fights on the horizon for the WBC belt after the Stavern Wilder mess is sorted out. But it appears, at least for now, that Klitschko is very, very close to a fight with Bryant Jennings. I'll be positive about this fight before I rain down a bit of negativity on it. The positives are, number one, it's not against Shannon Briggs, it's not against Marco Huck, it's against an undefeated opponent with desire. He's not just coming for a payday. You'd assume Bryant Jennings is going to come to win, fighting in America, fighting on HBO, fantastic opportunity for him. He's also a very, very athletic heavyweight, good mover, relatively agile, which you've got to like in an opponent, especially after seeing some of Wladamir's more recent opposition. And the other thing about Bryant Jennings is, I know he's not the tallest guy out there, he's probably not as tall as a Kubrat Pulev, certainly not as tall as a Tyson Fury, but he has real oversized reach. I believe his reach is actually bigger than Klitschko's, despite the fact he's a smaller man. So, even though he's not a big man in the sort of classic sense of the word, there is scope for him to cause problems with Wladamir. That kind of style, because he's got the movement, he's got the athleticism, he's got the agility, he's got a long, long jab, good reach. He's also undefeated, he's fighting in America, it's going to be a huge payday for him. There's all sorts of reasons which mean that this is potentially a good fight. And I certainly believe it is going to be a better fight than Marco Huck or Shannon Briggs would have provided. However, for me, this is a case of too much too soon for Bryant Jennings. Had I been involved in his team, I would have advised him to go down the WBC route, as those two fighters, both Wilder and Stavern, have more obvious flaws to me than Klitschko. Jennings deserves a place as a top 10 heavyweight because he's got victories over Arthur Spilka, who recently impressed against Thomas Ademic, and Mike Perez. I'm a Mike Perez fan. I view Mike Perez as a top 10 heavyweight. Arthur Spilka, I'm not convinced on, but I view him as a top 25 heavyweight. I'm sure, even though I know people disagree with me on Mike Perez, the general consensus would be Perez and Spilka are both top 20, top 30 heavyweights. And Jennings has beaten those guys. He's also beaten Ljakovic, he's beaten an adequate level of opposition, and he does justify being a top 10 fighter. However, for my eyes, Mike Perez gave him all sorts of trouble. He won that fight because he was athletic, he was fit, and don't get me wrong, that's a huge bonus that Jennings is bringing fitness, athleticism to the table. But I think Mike Perez won the vast majority of the early rounds in that fight. And I think, bar the fact that Perez was docked a very debatable point in the last round, Perez would have gone on to win that fight. I had Perez ahead. Maybe I'm slightly biased. I've followed Mike Perez from the start. I'm a big Perez fan. But I've watched the fight back since. I'd recommend everyone does so. I think Mike Perez dominated the early parts of that fight. And perhaps similar to the Chris Eubanks Saunders versus Billy Joe Saunders, Chris Eubanks Jr. versus Billy Joe Saunders fight. I think Eubank only came on in that fight when Saunders started to drop the pace and become tired. I think it's actually the same with Perez Jennings. I think when Perez was fully fit, when he had his stamina about him, Jennings couldn't get near him. Perez was able to evade his long jab with foot movement, with head movement. Perez was able to land on him. Perez was able to establish his jab. Perez landed the better quality of work. And that day, Jennings' athleticism, Jennings' fitness got him through a debatable 12 rounds. Now, whilst he deserves credit for that, there are two problems here. Number one, Klitschko, like Mike Perez, has a fantastic amateur pedigree, technical background. Klitschko far exceeded Mike Perez's achievements by winning the Olympic gold medal. Klitschko is also a superb athlete, like Bryant Jennings. Jennings isn't going to be able to dominate Klitschko with his stamina and agility in the same way he did with Perez, because Klitschko is a superb athlete. Klitschko, we know, can fight for 12 rounds these days. His style is economical. He's also in fantastic shape. He's not going to come in a similar shape to Mike Perez and fade late on in a fight. You know, for Jennings to win this, he can't rely just on his fitness and the other guy fading. He's going to bring more to the table than that. And I think Klitschko is going to cause the same technical problems for him that Mike Perez did. I think Jennings' lack of amateur background and lack of a sort of technical pedigree really cost him in that fight in the early rounds. And I think against Klitschko the same thing will happen again, but I don't think Jennings is going to be able to assert his stamina like he did on Perez. Now, finally, the other thing I'd say is, I know Jennings hasn't given us too much cause to be concerned about his chin necessarily, but if Klitschko is able to land on him in the same way Perez was able to in the early rounds, it could potentially be an early night. I know Jennings is a very fast, fit, agile, some would use the word slick boxer. For my eyes, he's hittable, as was proven in the Mike Perez fight. And I think if Klitschko is able to land on him, you know, Perez, I'm a big fan of him, not the biggest puncher. Spilka, he's okay, but he's not the biggest puncher. If Klitschko is able to land on you like that, you're in trouble. So, I don't think it's the worst fight. I think it's better, more competitive than the likes of Son and Briggs, Marco Huck. But if we're being realistic, I don't see Bryant Jennings as having a chance of winning this fight. I don't think he's got the power or the inside game to affect Vlad that way, and I don't think he's technically sound enough to rely on the jab and move game. I don't think his fitness and his stamina will allow him to dominate the late rounds like it did against Mike Perez. Klitschko's a different beast. Prediction, Klitschko win, probably lean towards knockout. Let me know your thoughts. Thanks for watching.